We're focusing on the fatal crash in Tempe, Arizona, back in March 2018.
Right, the one involving an Uber test vehicle and a pedestrian, Elaine Herzberg.
That's the one, and we're going to unpack it.
Okay, so let's be clear. This isn't just about a computer glitch, and it's not just about a distracted driver. It is this incredibly complex, multi-layered disaster.
It really is. Our sources for this are mainly the huge National Transportation Safety Board reports, the NTSB reports, plus a lot of human factors research and corporate documents that came out afterward.
And what they all show is how this whole systemic breakdown happened. The NTSB actually called it a perfect storm.
A perfect storm. That's a good way to put it. It was this convergence of, specific software flaws, some pretty serious organizational negligence, and a really core predictable problem in how humans and automation interact.
And that storm, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. I mean, it was basically manufactured by a series of engineering choices and a specific corporate culture.
Absolutely. So we're going to move past the headlines today, past the initial shock of it, and really examine the detailed timeline. We're going to look at that crucial cognitive gap that opens up when you asked a human being to be the flawless backup for a machine that is, almost all of the time, incredibly reliable.
So our mission today is to trace the four big failures that converged here: the technical, the human, the corporate, and the regulatory, to understand why this happened and what it still means for the entire self-driving industry today.
All right, so to start, let's just establish the facts. The scene. We have a developmental system run by Uber's Advanced Technologies Group, or ATG.
And this is housed in a Volvo XC90 SUV.
Right, a big SUV. And the system, the automated driving system, or ADS, it was engaged. It was operating in autonomous mode on a pre-mapped test route in Tempe.
And the conditions, it was nighttime. The sources are pretty clear that there was street lighting, but the victim, Elaine Herzberg, she was crossing mid-block.
Not in a crosswalk.
Not in a crosswalk, and she was pushing a bicycle. The NTSB reports also point out this kind of weird environmental factor. The median she was crossing from had this decorative brick pattern.
An X shape.
Yeah, an X shape that it kind of looked like a pathway. It wasn't one, but it could give that impression. So she's essentially jaywalking where the vehicle isn't really programmed to expect a pedestrian.
And this is where we get into that terrifying 5.6-second timeline leading up to the impact. The ADS, the car's brain, it first detected the pedestrian at that 5.6-second mark.
And how far away was that?
About 350 feet away. The vehicle at this point is moving at a steady 44, maybe 45 miles per hour.
350 feet. That feels like a lot of distance. 5.6 seconds is a long time in driving terms.
It's an eternity. For a human driver who's paying attention, 5.6 seconds is more than enough time to see something, process it, and react, even to a high-speed threat like this one.
Okay, so the system saw her 5.6 seconds out, but it failed to understand what it was seeing. This is the first big technical failure we need to break down.
That's it. The system used what's called sensor fusion. It combines data from Lidar, radar, and cameras. But from the moment of detection, it just entered the state of complete confusion.
It couldn't classify the object.
It couldn't. It cycled through misclassifications. First, it tagged her as a vehicle.
A vehicle? She's a person with a bike.
Right. Then, as she got closer, the data signature changed a bit, and it reclassified her as an unknown object.
Which is not helpful.
Not helpful at all. And then, just moments before impact, it finally settled on bicyclist. The crucial point here is that the system never accurately identified her as a pedestrian or even a pedestrian pushing a bicycle.
And because it didn't know what she was, it couldn't predict what she would do.
Exactly. It never generated a path prediction that was consistent with her actual movement across the road.
So why this constant identity crisis? I mean, you have three different types of sensors: Lidar, radar, cameras. Why couldn't they agree on what they were looking at?
This is where it gets really fascinating and, frankly, pretty damning from an engineering perspective. The sources show this failure was tied to a very specific design choice.
What was that?
The Uber ATG system was designed to exclude tracking history for what it called non-persisting objects.
Non-persisting objects. What does that mean?
It means any object whose classification changed.
Wait, let me get this straight. If you or I are driving, and we see something in the distance, and at first we think maybe it's an animal, but then we get closer and realize, oh, that's a person. Our brain doesn't just forget that we saw something a second ago.
Of course not. You update the classification, but you retain the object's history, its speed, its trajectory. You know it's been moving continuously.
But the ATG system didn't do that.
It did the exact opposite. Every single time the ADS changed its mind, from vehicle to unknown object to bicyclist, it wiped the historical data.
So it was like its memory got wiped every few milliseconds.
Precisely. It treated the object as a brand new detection each time, which meant it kept resetting the path prediction. It couldn't build a consistent understanding that this object was moving laterally at speed across its path.
That feels like a foundational flaw.
It was. This design choice, which was probably intended to reduce ghost objects or clean up messy sensor data, proved to be absolutely fatal. It prevented the system from recognizing a continuous threat.
So that's the perception failure. But even with all that confusion, there were still 5.6 seconds on the clock. The real technical failure here is that the system chose not to act.
Correct. After all that time, the ADS only decided a collision was truly imminent at 1.2 seconds before impact.
1.2 seconds.
And even then, even at that point, the system actively prevented itself from braking hard.
That's the part I just can't wrap my head around. Why? What possible logic is there for a car to decide a crash is about to happen and then not slam on the brakes?
The sources confirm there were two intertwined and, in hindsight, catastrophic design choices at play here. First was something they called action suppression.
Action suppression.
For 1 full second before impact, the system was programmed to suppress any braking action.
But why?
The goal was to prevent what engineers call nuisance stops or false alarms. They wanted to give the human operator a chance to take over and veto what might be an unnecessary emergency stop.
So they were prioritizing a smooth ride, a smooth testing experience over immediate collision mitigation.
That's the trade-off they made. They prioritized reducing disruption over reducing injury in a critical moment.
That's one choice. What was the second?
The second was about the braking capacity itself. The ADS was programmed not to apply maximum emergency braking if the crash was deemed unavoidable within its own preset limits.
It had its own limits, lower than what the car could actually do.
Yes. The internal limit was set to a deceleration of less than 0.71 grams. The NTSB reports confirmed that avoiding this crash would have required harder braking than that.
So, because the math said a crash was unavoidable under its own conservative rules, the system just gave up on avoiding it.
It gave up on avoiding it, and it also gave up on mitigating it. Instead of braking as hard as the Volvo physically could to lessen the impact, it just defaulted to a gradual slowdown and an auditory alert to the operator.
It just beeped at her.
It beeped at her and passed the hot potato to the person in the driver's seat at the very moment the crash became mathematically certain by its own flawed logic.
They were expecting the human to perceive the threat, understand the need for a full emergency stop, and execute it, all within that 1 second window.
An impossible task, a task that we know from decades of research is nearly impossible for a human under that kind of stress and time pressure.
And to make this all so much worse, they had actively removed the car's own built-in safety net.
They had. The Volvo XC90 comes standard with an advanced driver assistance system, an ADS. It has forward collision warning and automatic emergency braking, AEB.
And Uber ATG just switched it off.
They deactivated it. The reasoning was they were afraid of technical conflicts between the factory system and their own developmental software.
And what did the NTSB say about that decision?
Their analysis was absolutely damning. They ran simulations, and those simulations strongly suggested that the standard Volvo AEB system, if it had been active, would likely have either avoided the collision entirely,
Or at the very least.
at the very least, it would have scrubbed off enough speed to make the impact survivable. By removing that proven, redundant safety layer, Uber gambled everything on its own unproven software, and they lost.
Okay, so we've established the machine failed on multiple critical levels. But that machine had a human supervisor, the vehicle operator.
And this is where the NTSB was very, very clear. They placed the probable cause of this crash squarely on the failure of that operator.
Her failure to monitor the driving environment and the ADS because she was visually distracted.
By her personal cell phone.
The details from the inward-facing camera are just excruciating.
They are. The video shows her glancing away from the road for long periods of time. The reports confirm she had her phone down near the center console and she was actively streaming a television show.
Do we know what she was watching?
The sources identify it as The Voice, or at least content from Hulu, but the point is she was streaming video throughout the autonomous operation.
Which just speaks volumes about how she perceived the job.
Yeah.
So let's sync up the timelines, the operator's actions versus the car's detection.
Okay. So the ADS detects the pedestrian at 5.6 seconds out. About half a second before that, so around 6 seconds before the crash, her gaze goes down toward the phone.
And it stays there.
It stays fixed on the phone until about 1 second before impact. She only looks up when she hears that auditory alert or maybe saw something in her periphery.
And her reaction when she looked up?
Far too late. She grabs the steering wheel, which disengages the ADS, at negative 0.02 seconds, literally milliseconds before impact.
And the brakes.
She hits the brakes 0.7 seconds after the SUV struck Mrs. Herzberg. The human intervention, the final safety backstop the entire system was designed around, was completely non-existent.
And the legal consequences were severe. She was indicted on negligent homicide charges.
She was in 2020. And in July 2023, she eventually pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, endangerment, and got 3 years of probation. It's really hard to argue against that finding of gross negligence.
It is, if you just look at the raw fact of her watching a phone. The NTSB confirmed it. They said if she had been attentive, she would have had enough time to stop the SUV.
Within about 3.5 seconds from when the ADS first detected the threat, the physics allowed for it, the speed and the distance were there for a human to intervene, if that human was vigilant.
But, and this is the pivot in our deep dive, if the NTSB blames the operator, why does so much of the human factors research argue that Uber ATG basically set her up to fail?
This is where we have to talk about automation complacency. It's a known psychological state. It's what predictably happens when a human is asked to monitor a highly reliable automated system.
The system works perfectly 99.9% of the time.
Right. So the human develops this unjustified assumption that everything is fine. They start to trust it too much. Their vigilance drops. They check out.
And this isn't a new idea. It's not unique to self-driving cars.
Not at all. It's been documented for decades in other high-reliability fields like aviation. The NTSB report itself links this to airline accidents, like a 1987 crash in Detroit, where the pilot's over-reliance on the autopilot contributed to the disaster. They call them hazardous states of awareness.
Like just spacing out from sheer boredom.
Exactly. You put a person in a car on a predictable route, where their only job for hours on end is to not drive, but to be instantly ready to take control in a fraction of a second. You're creating an impossible cognitive load.
There was research on this even before the Tempe crash, right?
From Volvo. Yes, Volvo's own research demonstrated this perfectly. Their studies showed drivers supervising reliable automation would do things like fall asleep or have off-road glances that lasted for more than 8 seconds. They just assumed the system had it covered.
So the job description demands constant vigilance, but the actual work environment fosters intense boredom and distraction. That's the conflict.
That is the fundamental psychological trap. And it leads us to the most critical and maybe the most disturbing finding from all this human factors research.
What's that?
It's something called the expectation mismatch. The Volvo study found that even when they used reminders to keep the driver's eyes on the road and their hands on the wheel, 28% of those drivers still crashed in the test scenarios.
28%. Wait, that changes everything. If their eyes were on the threat and they still crashed, what does that say about this whole concept of a human backup?
It says the failure isn't just visual, it's cognitive. The driver saw the hazard, but they failed to recognize the need for action.
Because they expected the car to handle it.
They had a deeply ingrained expectation that the automation, which had been driving flawlessly, would do its job. They were waiting for the car to brake, but the car, in this case, was waiting for them.
So the NTSB's conclusion that eyes on path is necessary but not sufficient. This is what they're talking about.
That's exactly it. The operator has to have the cognitive readiness to intervene instantly. And Uber's entire design philosophy, suppressing the braking, handing control back in the last second, was based on a dangerously flawed assumption about human attention.
They designed a system where the human was the absolute single point of failure.
That's the takeaway. The operator was clearly negligent, yes. But the corporation and the engineers designed a job that maximized the probability of that negligence becoming fatal.
So if we trace that negligence up the chain, we get to the organization itself, Uber ATG. The NTSB analysis really paints a picture of a company that was just moving too fast.
A company that was prioritizing rapid development and scaling up their testing over basic fundamental safety procedures.
Let's start with a huge structural change they made just 5 months before the crash. They went from having 2 operators in every vehicle down to just 1.
A single operator.
Why? I mean, was this just a cost-cutting move?
ATG claimed it was because their new HMI, their tablet interface, made it easier for one person to do both jobs, monitor the road, and tag important data for the engineers.
But the NTSB concluded that was a catastrophic mistake.
A massive error. Because having two people in the car isn't just about workload, it's about redundancy. One person's job is the road, the other's is the system. It's a check and a balance.
So by removing that second person, the redundant monitor, Uber didn't just remove a layer of safety.
They dramatically increased the complexity of the main operator's job. Now, one person had to split their attention between the unpredictable outside world and the internal system status, all while fighting off that automation complacency we just talked about.
It basically created the perfect environment for an operator to think they could get away with streaming a TV show. There was no one sitting next to them to call them out.
And that points to the broader issue of their safety culture, or really the lack thereof. The NTSB found ATG was severely lacking. They had no formal safety management system, an SMS.
An SMS, that's standard in aviation, right? It's a proactive way to manage risk.
It is. It's a formal framework for identifying hazards, assessing risks, and putting controls in place before an accident happens. Uber ATG was operating a high-risk test program without one.
And they didn't have the right people in charge of safety either.
No dedicated safety manager with a real background in risk management. And even the policies they did have on paper, like a strict rule against cell phone use, the enforcement was just sporadic. It was weak.
They had the inward-facing cameras. They could have been monitoring this.
They could have been, but they weren't. Supervisors only did these undocumented ad hoc spot checks of the footage. There was no systematic review.
And the drug testing failure you mentioned, that seems particularly bad.
It's very telling. They had a policy requiring drug tests after any incident. Yet this operator had never been tested during her employment, not even after this fatal crash. It shows a profound failure to enforce their own basic safety rules.
So the NTSB's conclusion was that this inadequate safety culture created the conditions for the operator's distraction to happen.
It directly contributed to it, yes.
Okay, let's zoom out again. To the regulatory environment that allowed this culture to even exist. This testing was happening in Arizona, which everyone was calling the Wild West of AV testing.
And that's not an exaggeration. The sources show a very conscious, proactive effort by the state government to lure these companies in. The governor, Doug Ducey, publicly welcomed Uber with open arms and wide open roads.
And this was right after California had kicked them out over safety concerns.
Exactly. Arizona positioned itself as the place to go if you wanted to avoid strict regulation. Their framework was set up by executive order, and it was all about prioritizing innovation over safety oversight.
So companies like Uber could test on public roads without having to prove their systems were safe first.
Correct. There was no rigorous, safety-focused application process. The NTSB later slammed Arizona for this laissez-faire approach and recommended all states implement one.
And this state-level permissiveness was only possible because there was a vacuum at the federal level.
Right.
Where was NHTSA in all of this?
The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Their guidance was weak. They published policy with 12 safety elements, but here's the kicker. Submitting a safety self-assessment report to them was, and still largely is, completely voluntary. Voluntary. So the NTSB was emphatic. They said submission has to be mandatory. There needs to be a uniform, minimal level of safety assessment for everyone. Because when safety is optional, companies under intense commercial pressure will always be tempted to cut corners.
And this whole regulatory mess is made worse by the language the industry itself uses. We're talking about level 3 automation, but car makers use all these confusing marketing terms.
The terminology is dangerously ambiguous. The SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, has these clear definitions. Level 3, 4, 5. That's a true automated driving system, an ADS. But then you have level 2 systems, which require constant human supervision.
And they're called autopilot or ProPilot.
Exactly. When you call a level 2 system that needs hands-on vigilance autopilot, you are creating that same deadly expectation mismatch. You're priming the public to assume a car can do more than it actually can.
It blurs the line between assistance and autonomy.
And that confusion, that widening cognitive gap, it's exactly what puts the human in an impossible position when the system suddenly fails.
The crash in Tempe obviously forced an immediate, massive shutdown for Uber ATG. They stopped all public road testing everywhere in March 2018.
And the NTSB reports catalog a whole series of really critical changes they made in the aftermath to fix the flaws we've been talking about.
The first changes were all about putting the safety nets back in place.
Right. Reinstating redundancy. The very first thing they did was turn the native Volvo safety systems back on, the forward collision warning and the automatic emergency braking. They were reactivated to run alongside the ADS.
So that independent layer of safety was put back. And they immediately reversed the staffing model.
Immediately, that single operator model was scrapped. Testing only resumed with 2 mission specialists in the car, one to watch the road, one to watch the system.
And on the software side, the changes were pretty dramatic.
They had to be. That 1-second action suppression period was completely eliminated. The system no longer waits for human confirmation if it sees an imminent threat.
And they fixed the flawed logic about braking.
They did. The path prediction was updated to account for jaywalking. It now assumes a pedestrian outside a crosswalk might try to cross. And crucially, the system was updated to engage maximum braking for crash mitigation.
Not just avoidance.
Right. It gets rid of that restrictive 0.71 G limit. Now, if the car determines it can't avoid a crash, it will still brake as hard as it possibly can to minimize the speed and force of the impact.
And they had to overhaul how they managed the operators to fight that complacency problem.
A formal safety management system was finally put in place. New training modules on fatigue, distraction, and they installed a new system to monitor the mission specialists in real time.
So no more just checking video footage days later. This is live.
It's live. It's a system from a company called Notto. It uses the inward-facing camera, and if it detects the driver looking away for more than a few seconds, it sounds an audible chime right there in the vehicle.
A real-time prompt.
A prompt, and it also reports the incident to a supervisor for follow-up coaching. It's a huge shift from that hands-off culture they had before.
Okay, let's talk more about the technology. That sensor fusion problem. The solution isn't just having 3 sensors, it's about making them cross-check each other.
That's it, exactly. The research is clear. Sophisticated information fusion is critical, but it's not just about getting a clear picture of the world, it's about robust fault diagnosis.
Meaning one sensor needs to be able to tell when another sensor is wrong.
Precisely. The ability of, say, a radar system to detect an object's motion and then use that data to diagnose a failure in the camera. Maybe the camera is blinded by sun glare. That's essential for safety. A robust system will use the consistent data from the radar to flag the camera data as unreliable.
And that would prevent the kind of perception cycling we saw in Tempe.
Yeah.
The system wouldn't have kept changing its mind.
It would have had more confidence in the object's continued existence and path. Without that diagnostic cross-check, you're just relying on single-point accuracy, which is guaranteed to fail in edge cases.
Moving from the technical to the more philosophical, this whole thing inevitably brings up the classic ethical dilemma, the trolley problem.
It always does. Who does the car decide to sacrifice in an unavoidable crash? The programming forces manufacturers to confront how they value human life.
And the surveys on this are always so conflicted.
They are. Intellectually, people say they want AVs to be utilitarian, to make the choice that saves the most lives overall. So sacrifice the 1 passenger to save 5 pedestrians.
But nobody wants to buy the car that's programmed to sacrifice them.
And that's the contradiction. People are far less likely to purchase an AV that might sacrifice them or their family for the greater good. So you have this market problem where the safest cars, ethically speaking, might not sell, which defeats the whole purpose of reducing crashes overall.
So how are car makers actually approaching this? Are they building these sacrificial algorithms?
For the most part, no. They reject that model. The preferred approach from groups at Stanford and companies like Ford is more rule-based. They're focused on systems like responsibility-sensitive safety, or RSS.
And the goal there is what?
The goal is to design a system that makes the crash preventable in the first place. It's about aggressively maintaining safe distances, predicting dangerous actions, and building in such large safety buffers that the classic trolley problem never even has a chance to materialize in the real world.
So the solution is to engineer the problem out of existence.
It's focusing on crash prevention, not on fatal choice programming. And that prevention-first philosophy is exactly what Uber ATG was forced to adopt after this tragedy.
The story of Uber's self-driving unit, which started with so much ambition and led to such a profound failure, it ended with a corporate exit.
It did. In December 2020, Uber sold the whole thing, the Advanced Technologies Group, to a competitor, Aurora Innovation.
And what was the strategy there? Just get rid of a troubled asset?
It was a strategic consolidation. Aurora got all of ATG's expertise, including all the hard-won lessons on safety engineering they learned post-crash, and combined it with their own platform to try and accelerate their development.
So what did the new combined company focus on?
Aurora announced their first big push would be into heavy-duty trucks and logistics. It's a huge market, and in some ways, a slightly less complex problem than urban ride-sharing.
And Uber's role.
Uber became a major partner. They invested $400 million in Aurora, and the Uber CEO joined their board. So the technology is still connected to Uber's network, but it's no longer their internal project to manage. It was the end of that chapter.
So we've covered a massive amount of ground. We started with this single tragic moment on a dark road in Tempe, and our deep dive, really guided by the NTSB's investigation, has shown that this wasn't one failure. It was four major cascading failures all converging at once.
To quickly synthesize them, first you had the technology confusion and flawed design, that non-persisting object error, the active suppression of braking.
Second, you have the operator distraction, which we now understand is rooted in that predictable, documented challenge of automation complacency, the job-created boredom.
Third, the systemic organizational failures inside Uber ATG. Getting under the second operator, having no formal safety management system, not enforcing their own rules.
And finally, the regulatory vacuum. You had a permissive state in Arizona that basically invited risky testing and a lack of strong mandatory federal standards from NHTSA.
And while the NTSB did, in the end, place the probable cause on the distracted operator, it's impossible to separate her actions from the environment she was in. The corporate and design flaws were huge contributing factors.
She was, in a very real way, set up for failure by a system designed to expect a flawless human to rescue it from its own limitations.
Exactly. This tragedy really shows that the greatest risk in automation isn't just the machine failing. It's the machine failing in a way that a human can't possibly predict or respond to in time.
So what does all this mean for the level 3 systems that are now starting to appear on the market? The ones that ask you, the driver, to be ready to take over at a moment's notice.
I think the core lesson from Tempe remains the most powerful lesson for the whole industry and for us as consumers. As this conditional automation becomes more common, the most critical safety issue isn't a hardware failure or a software bug.
It's the cognitive gap.
It's that cognitive gap, the gap between what the human believes the machine can do and what that human is actually prepared to do when the machine inevitably reaches its limit.
And that raises a really critical question for you, for anyone listening. The next time you're in a car with some kind of automated system, ask yourself, is this automation truly operating safely within its known limits? Or is it just setting the stage for a critical human error? Because the most dangerous feature of a level 3 system might just be the quiet assumption that the human is still paying attention. Something to think about as we accelerate into a future where the machine is often the master and the human, tragically, is just the backup.